When a new black family moves into a quiet suburban neighborhood, one neighbor views them as a threat to everything he holds dear. Driven by suspicion and fear of change, he makes a fateful decision to call the police, setting off a chain of events that leads to a shocking revelation. But as he confronts the harsh reality of his own prejudice, his life begins to unravel. What follows will leave even the most seasoned observer stunned. But let's go back to the beginning. James Hale, recently appointed as the state prosecutor, was a man used to handling high responsibility and constant pressure at work. Yet, despite the complexities of his professional life, he always dreamed of a simple family happiness. Moving to a quiet suburban neighborhood seemed like the perfect opportunity for him, his wife, and their 2 children to start a new chapter where family values would take center stage instead of work stress. Their new home was a much-anticipated haven, cozy with a spacious backyard, perfect for barbecues and children's games. Inspired by the thought of a peaceful life, the family eagerly awaited balance in their lives. However, it soon became clear that not everyone in their new community shared this idyllic vision. Despite the outward respectability, this predominantly white neighborhood held a subtle but powerful atmosphere of mistrust and prejudice toward those who differed from the majority. One resident, Tom Reynolds, was the embodiment of this conservative mindset. A middle-aged white man with a strong sense of belonging to his neighborhood, he considered himself the unofficial guardian of proper order on these streets. In his eyes, the arrival of a black family posed a direct threat to the established harmony and way of life. To Tom, James and his family weren't just newcomers. They represented the kind of change he feared most. His life experience and principles told him that such changes could only lead to the destruction of what he valued. Tom immediately felt uneasy when he first saw James, a man in a business suit stepping out of a new car, clearly successful and self-assured. In Tom's eyes, James was an outsider who didn't fit the image of the neighbors he was used to. One day, while walking past the Hales' house, Tom noticed James sitting in his car, animatedly talking on the phone. What seemed like a routine moment sparked suspicion in Tom's mind. Why is he on the phone for so long? Tom thought. He began to question what might be behind this otherwise ordinary behavior. For Tom, this was a sign that something might be wrong with the new neighbor. Tom's suspicions grew, especially when he saw several black men enter the Hale house one evening. Maybe they're not just an ordinary family, but something more dangerous? They're definitely up to something, Tom convinced himself. Seeing himself as the protector of the neighborhood, he began closely watching every movement at James's house, certain that something illegal was happening right under his nose. Tom became increasingly consumed by his prejudiced thoughts, and being a man of action, he couldn't just stand by. His biases and fear of change pushed him toward interference. In his mind, he was doing everything for the well-being of his neighborhood. Tom felt it was time to act and stop the threat he had imagined. The next morning, Tom Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Thoughts about his new neighbor, a black man in an expensive suit who, in Tom's mind, didn't belong in this neighborhood, haunted him. His fears and biased beliefs intensified, fed by internal stereotypes. Tom convinced himself it was his duty to protect the community from undesirable elements. After pacing around the house for a while, he finally decided what to do. He would call the police. Nervously picking up the phone, Tom dialed the number. When the dispatcher answered, he immediately began describing the suspicious behavior at the Hales' house. "I'd like to report strange activity in our neighborhood," he began. His voice carried an uncertain tone, masked by a false sense of resolve. He detailed James' car, which he thought looked too luxurious for the area, as well as several guests who had visited the previous night. "They're not like us," he added, referring to the racial and social differences that troubled him. Confident that he was taking the right step to protect his prosperous neighborhood, Tom hung up the phone. He didn't consider how this action might affect James and his family. In his mind, everything was clear. The new neighbors were a threat, and only he could stop it. Within minutes, a police car pulled up outside the Hale residence. James, who was getting ready for work, noticed the flashing lights through the window. He frowned, unsure of what was happening. With confusion and caution, he stepped onto the porch to find out why the police had arrived. His heart tightened with worry, but his face remained calm and composed. As a state prosecutor, James was well versed in the law, but this was his first personal encounter with the police as a suspect. The two officers, clearly not expecting to encounter a successful black man in a suit, immediately adopted a defensive posture. One of them coldly asked, "Who's inside the house?" His voice carried an implied judgment that James's family didn't fit the traditional image of the neighborhood. The other officer closely inspected James's car and watched his movements as though expecting to find something suspicious. Fully aware of what was happening, James maintained an outward calm, even as he seethed with indignation inside. He asked the officers on what grounds they had stopped him and why they were there. One officer, avoiding a direct answer, simply said, "There was a call." The implication was clear. James's presence in the community had stirred concern, and the police were there to ensure safety. At that moment, James realized that his family had become the target of baseless accusations. Yet, instead of escalating the situation, he kept his composure. His legal expertise helped him remain firm, though he knew this wouldn't be easily resolved. Tensions on the Hales' porch began to rise rapidly. James, seeing that the officers continued their questioning without any clear reason, could no longer hold back his growing frustration. He looked the officers straight in the eyes and, still outwardly calm, demanded an explanation. "On what grounds are you stopping me and subjecting my family to this interrogation? What reason do you have to suspect us?" The officers hesitated. They realized the situation was quickly slipping out of their control, but they didn't know how to proceed. One glanced at his partner, as if seeking support, while the other reluctantly repeated, "There was a call." Their voices no longer carried the confidence they had at the start. They understood something was wrong. Meanwhile, Tom Reynolds, who had been watching the situation unfold from his porch since the police arrived, felt a surge of confidence. Seeing the police approach his new neighbor, he was sure he had done the right thing by calling them. Now, feeling bolstered by the authorities, he decided to intervene personally. Tom hurried over to the Hales' porch and, pointing at James, loudly declared, "This man is hiding something. I know for sure there's something illegal going on here. Just look at the people who've been going into his house. They're not like us. I'm sure they're up to something criminal." Tom was so sure of his righteousness that he didn't notice how his voice had grown louder and sharper, his face flushed with anger, and he no longer hesitated to express his prejudiced opinions. He was convinced the police would back him up in these accusations and arrest James. However, James's response was entirely unexpected for Tom and the officers. Keeping his composure and knowing the moment had arrived, James calmly pulled out his badge. His tone was restrained but authoritative. "My name is James Hale, and I'm the state prosecutor," he said, showing his badge to the officers. "Those people who came to my house are my colleagues. We were discussing ongoing legal matters." The moment seemed to freeze the air. The officers stood still, their faces pale. They exchanged glances, realizing just how ridiculous the situation had become. One of them nervously adjusted his belt, while the other was at a loss for words. As for Tom, he was dumbstruck. His earlier accusations now sounded hollow and absurd. He suddenly felt his confidence dissolve in the awkward silence. The realization that he had called the police without any basis, accusing a man of illegal actions solely based on his own prejudiced assumptions, hit Tom harder than he could have imagined. He stood in silence, unsure how to respond, while James continued to look at him with dignity and calm. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. After the police apologized to James and left, leaving Tom Reynolds standing alone in front of the house, his world began to fall apart. He stood on the porch, shocked by the events that had unfolded before his eyes. Tom felt that the control he had tried so desperately to maintain over his neighborhood had slipped through his fingers. He began to realize that it was his own fears and prejudices that had led to this humiliating moment. The town seemed to carry on with its usual life, but soon word of the incident began to spread. Some of the neighbors who had witnessed the police call had already shared the story with local news outlets, and it quickly caught the attention of the media. From time to time, Tom's phone rang. Journalists wanted his side of the story, but he didn't know what to say. The community began to discuss the incident, and racism and bias became central to the conversations. Tom, who had always considered himself a good citizen, now faced the fact that his actions were being seen as a manifestation of systemic racism. He found himself in the spotlight, something he had never expected. It was a painful revelation for him. The image he had long built, that of a man who keeps order in his community, had suddenly crumbled. Now he saw that his actions, which seemed normal and even necessary to him, were actually a reflection of deeply ingrained prejudices. Under the weight of public opinion and the realization of his role in the incident, Tom began to reflect on how his actions and beliefs had affected the lives of others. He replayed every moment of his interaction with James, starting from the first day they moved in. Tom realized that his fear of change and refusal to accept others who were different had led him to make a huge mistake. This realization was painful but necessary for his inner transformation. Meanwhile, James Hale, despite being deeply hurt by Tom's actions, found the strength to offer him a chance to apologize. James understood that real change begins with accepting mistakes and the desire to correct them. He decided to give Tom the opportunity to take a step toward reconciliation and change. Tom, realizing how wrong he had been, finally decided to take that chance. He understood that his biased views were the result of stereotypes and fear of the unknown. For the first time in a long time, he felt responsible for his actions. It was the beginning of his journey toward change. Admitting his mistake and taking the first step toward making amends became a turning point for Tom. He realized he needed not only to apologize to James, but also to change how he saw the world and how he treated others. The story didn't end with Tom's prejudice being exposed. It marked the beginning of his personal transformation. He had a long and difficult journey ahead to overcome deeply rooted biases and learn to see the world through the eyes of others, not just through the lens of his fears and dogmas.